There's a rule in our lives called the law of unintended circumstances. We find this to work out in just about every facet of our lives. If we want to have a pet snake, the unintended circumstances of that is when the hurricanes come ripping through Florida, all of the snakes in all of the pet shops are released into the wild. Now they have an unintended circumstance. If we try to plant a nice ground cover to stabilize creek beds and banks, we go and find a beautiful plant called kudzu, and we plant it all over the place, and suddenly it's taken over. If you go down into the south, that weed is everywhere. It does a great job. It just does a tremendous job, and they don't want it. Our lives are full of these kinds of examples. If you win the lottery, I heard about one lady who won the lottery in Washington State, and 2 years later she had to win the lottery again because she was so far in debt, and the second time she won the state lottery, it just went to cover her debts. You know, there are unintended circumstances, unintended consequences to all of our behaviors because we just do not know the future. We don't know all of the ramifications of what goes on in our lives and the decisions that we make. You know, I did not realize that, 25 years ago when Lucy was born, that 25 years later I would be woken up in the middle of the night to comfort her because of the death of her loved one. I just did not realize that at the time. I should have, because we were getting up, every 3 hours, 2 hours? I should have figured, this is going to go on for a long time. But we have these unintended consequences. And today, as we look at Israel's choice of a king, we realize that they had unintended consequences, consequences that they were warned about, consequences that we are warned about, and we need to pay attention to these as well. Now, God knew that having a king was going to be both a good thing and a bad thing. And he had given them some warnings about bad kings in the past, in Deuteronomy 16 and following. There are warnings that God gave to Moses saying, you guys are going to want a king, but don't go there until I am willing to take you there. Because you do not understand the consequences. And in Deuteronomy, he lays out some of the consequences. So 400 years before they asked for a king, God knew what was going to happen. Now, in Samuel, we will find that there is a pattern of pro and anti-king statements. Some are for the king and some are against the king. Some say that sometimes it's good to have a king. Sometimes it says it's bad that you have a king. And as Samuel goes through this, we will realize that it doesn't matter whether we have a king or not. It doesn't matter whether what choices we make. What matters is that we are trusting in the Lord through all of these decisions. And the times that they had a bad king, the times that the kings that they received were horrible, they realized, or they needed to realize, that it was because they weren't trusting in the Lord. And they weren't trusting in the Lord in today's statement. And so they end up with something that they did not want to happen. Now, there were many reasons why they needed to have a king. Only one of them is important for our story today. Samuel really just points out the fact that they had a bad decision because they were not trusting in the Lord, because they were turning their back on the Lord, and because they didn't want to follow God. So one of the things that they was going on in their world was that they had failed to establish a way of continuing to provide judges and an adequate number of judges to Israel. You know, when Gideon was alive, he thought, okay, I'll just appoint my kids. Well, that didn't last. They could not figure out a way of sustaining the system. Eli's sons were horrible. Samuel's sons in today's story were bad. They could not figure out what exactly was going on, and they could not find enough qualified judges to lead Israel. They were also having trouble with their national identity. Their their judges were usually only over a local area, a small area. Samuel was the first judge that really judged all of Israel. And so they realized this was a good thing. Can't we have a national identity instead of all these regional things? And then they had a perceived need that they needed more human leadership when it came to war. Now, the elders that come to Samuel this day were the same group of elders, maybe different people, but the same group, that had taken the ark into battle. They still didn't realize what it took to win a war. And so they come to Samuel today and say, we want a human leader who will take us into war. They didn't want to deal with the real fact of the problem was, and that was their sin. They wanted to have a form of government that was like the other nations. And really, I think that is the most damning statement in this whole thing. They wanted to be like every other pagan in the world. Yet God had called them to be unique. God had called them to follow him. But they wanted to be like everybody else. I think the most fundamental reason here that God objected to their having a king, and their most fundamental flaw in wanting a king, was that they were rejecting God. They were rejecting God as their king. They wanted somebody on this earth that they could see and touch and look to follow. And they were rejecting God as their king. Well, when God honors their request, he gave them precisely what they wanted. He gave them exactly what the world gets. They wanted to be like a king, and so like the nations, and so he gave them a king. His name was Saul. And in a couple weeks, we'll start talking about Saul, and we'll realize that the other nations had giants, guys named Goliath and people like that. Well, Saul was a head taller than anybody else. They got a tall king. The other kings around there worshipped all kinds of different gods. Saul worshipped all kinds of different gods. You know, they got a king exactly like all the other nations. And he persecuted them. He enslaved them. He made them go into battle when God had not told them to, and so lots of their people died. And as Rachel read, he made their daughters cook. That's a horrible thing. Did you see that in there? He made their daughters cook. I don't know. Making your daughters cook, that's just way too much. But he made them like all the other nations. Well, as we look at this story, we start off by seeing that Samuel had gotten old and his sons were not following in his footsteps. You know, sometimes even the most godly people will have children that do not follow after him, that are susceptible to other things. I don't know what made Samuel's kids susceptible to being bribed, susceptible to calling wrong right and right wrong, but they did. When he grew old, he knew that he needed to appoint judges. He knew that there needed to be some transfer of power from himself to other people. But he didn't seem to be able to get the job done. He didn't seem to have a mechanism for appointing them. Now, the original pattern in the Bible was to have a kingdom of priests, or even Levites. That's what a hierarch, whatever that word is. I need that third grade Bible. It needs to be a kingdom that was led by judges who were honest, who were truthful, who were fair, but they didn't seem to be able to get it. Joel and Abijah turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. This was the problem with every form of judgment that they had. Once the godly person passed away, once the godly person had grown old, they again reverted to taking bribes. And so the Israel's elders come and demand a king. The facts of the whole thing is that Samuel was growing old. His successors were not doing the job that they should have been, and so they had an alternative pattern. Now the problem here is not that the alternative pattern was bad or good, but that they hadn't consulted with God, and they weren't willing to be submissive. They came with a demand, give us a king. Samuel prays, but these guys hadn't. They hadn't looked to the Lord for what they should do. They hadn't asked and said, what does God want us to do? Now, we'll find out later that God had said in various places that you're going to have good kings. You know, and he is not opposed to necessarily having a king. But when we come to him and demand our way, God gives us our way.